Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are around the world, around the country, around the state, around the city. Welcome to another episode of the Soul Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Theresa J. Canada. And today I'd like to go a little bit into some issues related to politics affecting education. I mentioned it a while ago that I would talk about this topic. So I'm going to use a little bit more and delve a little bit more into this topic. And hopefully you'll get some idea of the historical perspective related to how, in fact, politics affects education, if you didn't know it before. So there are a couple of topics I want to refer to here. And I'll go to headline. 1, historical. 2, current issues. And then 3, the funding. These are the areas I want to briefly discuss today. So we all know throughout history, there's been politics influence in education policies. And the main one started, this is across the country. This is not just in certain parts of the country. This is in parts of the country. Even though I focus on the North and Midwest schooling, this is something that was comprehensive throughout the country. And the biggest thing that started really was politics had played a significant role in shaping education policies. And one of the ones back in the early 20th century was standardized testing, okay? And they felt that standardized testing would become a more equalized opportunity, educational opportunity for all students. So that's what they say, okay? So, but other people said that the narrow focus on tests and, ignoring the critical thinking skills and ignoring creativity students was not helpful. So that's constantly a debate. That's a constant debate. Now, I don't know for sure from my perspective if standardized testing was making it equal educational opportunities, because I think many people did not test well, all right? How can you take a test and do well on it when you're not given the basic resources and information to be able to take the test? Also, the fact that one's exposure and background impacts how you respond to questions on the test. Who develops the test? Okay. Who are the people who sit and develop the test that you take? What's their perspectives like? What their background is like? So their perception and their background determines how they assess or establish the kind of questioning that takes place. Why do I say that? Easy. If anybody's watched a game show on television or wherever you watch it on your phone or whatever, the game shows many times and I'm not gonna say specific game show, but they survey people, and then the survey, answers come up, and you're supposed to decide, guess what the survey came up with, the number that the survey came up with. Well, if you listen to some of these shows, you'll think, who developed these questions and who are the people who responded to them? Well, I can tell you right now how one's background and exposure will determine oftentimes how you respond to things. So if that's for a game show, can you imagine what it's like for standardized tests? And of course, the historical piece, this is across the country, that at some point, most Black and brown people did not do well on standardized testing. Go figure. Why do you think that was the case? All right, I'm just throwing it out there. You can answer if you want to, but I have my opinions. So if you're not exposed to certain things that are similar, and if those who design the exams, that's the other thing. Their perspective is going to determine how the questions are developed. And they expect a certain response based upon their perception. So that's part of what the issues were in the early 20th century. And that's why certain people did not pass the test to go to this specialized school, or did not pass the test to go to this to pass the advanced placement test. Because it was, some of it, you have to realize, has to do with a person's background. and their life experiences. And that's something that wasn't taken into consideration. So the idea of critical thinking and and creativity was lost. So that's an issue. You talk about political influences on education policy. That's one of them. All right. Another one has to do with, we all talked, what I basically, my book was talking about the desegregation policies in the 1950s and the 60s. And much of it was basically run by racial discrimination. And that the Brown decision in 1954 is a perfect example. But if you investigate the Brown decision, and maybe I'll have an episode talking more in depth about the Brown decision, it wasn't cut and dry. And of course, there many people were involved in that particular decision in terms of setting up and presenting. And I'm sure the NAACP Legal Defense Fund had various people coming and interviewing and so forth. And I know the Clarks, the psychologists, the Black, well-known Black psychologists, were instrumental in providing information for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But basically, the decisions that came to the implementation of these segregation policies in the 1950s and 60s was basically driven by the efforts to combat racial discrimination. Okay, that was the impetus, I think. So the aim was to basically provide equal educational opportunities for all students, regardless of their race or ethnicity. That was the goal. But did it really occur? All right, I'm not going to answer that, but I'll tell you, not necessarily. All right. Because if you think about the talking points that we hear, if even within my book, there were some of the girls in the book talked about, if we had the same resources in the schools that we were attending previously than going to the so-called desegregated school, then we would have been fine staying in our regular school. So why couldn't we have the same resources? So the key was, it was like the lack of resources that were not the same as some of the other schools. So I'm just saying to you, and I mean, we know the stories about the South, okay? And the kinds of things that took place, but not much was different because of racial housing, segregated housing. So you attended schools where you lived, and if you attended schools where you lived, so whoever you lived around, you all went to school together. And it wasn't just, it was economic and racial, okay? All right, so you had a combination of things. But when many of the young girls, we attended schools away from our communities, it was hugely, I have to say, economic, drastically, definitely economic situation. But that didn't deter us from pursuing our educational accomplishments, but it could have, all right? And like I mentioned before, I had a guest who talked about the trauma of young children, how that impacts them. And sometimes it could just make a person just not either participate or to be ashamed of their participation. So it varies. So now, what about the current political issues that are impacting education? Okay. The main one we think about, and that's not going to probably go away anytime soon, that basically has a direct impact on education, is school funding. Okay. The politicians make decisions about the allocation of resources, which significantly affect the quality of education. And we're going through that as we speak, okay? And that's an ongoing process. And of course, inadequate funding can lead to overcrowded schools, classrooms, outdated textbooks, lack of essential resources, on and on and on, okay? So that continues. And also, much of the funding takes place within the states, because federal funding, like, as we speak now, I don't even know if there'll still be the Department of Education. But by the time you listen to this episode, we don't know. But if you do the research, you find that most funding came directly from the states. And that's important to know. And within each state, it goes to localities, school districts. And depending upon where you live, determines how much funding you're going to probably get. And it's obvious that more wealthy communities have more funding than areas that don't have more wealthy parents. So it still impacts the education of students in those districts. And that's not going away anytime soon. Okay. So, inadequate funding is a key piece. All right. That's a key piece. But if you think about all the other dynamics that take place, who lives in certain communities, what resources are available, um, you know, it impacts what's happening in the schools, what resources schools have, and that makes a difference in the learning environment. All right, is it safe? And big thing now is safety in schools. Okay, and that's a big. It's not just now; it's been like in the past, but still, school safety is an issue. Um, Qualified teachers is an issue because even for several years, most teachers who were in the less resource schools were the less qualified teachers. Didn't have to be, but I don't know. In my day, when I went to school, the teachers in my schools were, well, especially the Black teachers, they were like way beyond, I think, the other teachers in a sense. I have to say it like I know it, okay? And probably because didn't have the same options that other teachers, and they didn't have any Black teachers in the elementary school I attended from fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, not a single one. So I'm just saying to you, they were limited to where they could even teach schools that may have had more resources, but they did the best they could while they were wherever they were teaching. So the next topic has to do with in terms of political issues related to impacting education, is the current debate over school choice. Not that that's anything new, but that's really the latest thing we're talking about. It's like charter schools, voucher programs, and alternatives to traditional public schooling. Those are debates that are going to be ongoing from now until. So just get ready, and it's really, has a lot of consequences for students and their families, as well as the overall educational system. Um, and you have to think about, if parents can afford to pay for private schools, they'll send their kids to private schools opposed to public schools. But public schools are supposed to be open to everyone. I feel you should get as best education as possible in a public school, if possible. And I know people argue the resources, of going out of the public schools is going to these other charter schools and so forth and so on. My point is that wherever you can get the best education, you need to get it. Simple as that. And I think that it's good to know that we have options. If you go back to like the Black Panther Party, they had schools and food, served foods for people. And many people didn't like that, but that was pretty much similar to what's going on now, isn't it? So I'm giving that to you so you can get some thought. Think about that. And we'll address it in other future episodes and see if it'll write some comments, and maybe I'll deal with it later. But basically, I'm going to just talk about those topics today. And I'll get back to you with some other topics related to funding and resource allocation of education, and curriculum and standards that are affected by the politics as well. So until the next time, thank you for joining, and thank you for putting your comments. Thank you for subscribing. Please subscribe. And I'll see you again on another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters. Have a great day, everyone. Bye now.